Christianity and the history of science. This is a subject that I have been interested in for more than half a century. I've had an unusual academic background that may leave me some peculiar qualifications to address some of this in ways that are rarely addressed. First thing I need to make sure everybody knows, this is not a creation versus evolution course. This is not a course in which we will dispose of biology. We are looking at the whole history of science. Creation and evolution do come up in it. My daughter, Sharon, who is a biologist, may come in and give us a short talk titled, "What Evolution Ain't." She's planning it now. Things you don't have to worry about because biologists no longer believe them. The other thing that is really, 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 really important is this is not going to be the Michael Covington view of science and Christianity, not if I can help it. Yes, the traffic going by outside, I don't quite know what that was. Somebody moving furniture. Okay, yes. Maybe I'll edit a minute of video out there. But, okay, this is not going to be a course in the Michael Covington personal perspective or the Michael Covington peculiar ideas about Christianity and science. As far as possible, I'm going to be giving you things, telling you what well-informed historians agree on, even non-Christians. And behind this is the fact that many people who are well-educated in science are not well-informed about the history of science, either the history of the relation of science and Christianity or the history of anything else. History of science is a neglected field, and you can learn a lot of science without learning much about how it got to be there. My qualifications, well, some of you know I have degrees in linguistics and then worked in artificial intelligence for many years in academia and now in industry. But history and philosophy of science have been major interests of mine since high school. My dissertation, okay, this is one of the strangest dissertation topics any linguistics department ever came across. But both Cambridge and Yale jumped on it with cries of glee because, you know, they like strange things. My dissertation, which I finished at Yale, having started some of the work at Cambridge, was on how medieval logicians explained the relation between sentence structure and meaning. That is, how do you connect grammar to logic? That turns out to be crucially important if you want computers to understand human languages. And I found some work done back in the 1200s that was relevant to it and proceeded to dig it up and present it. Logic was very highly developed in the Middle Ages, neglected since actually, but that took me deep into the bigger picture of science in the Middle Ages. Yes, there was science in the Middle Ages. And some of these medieval insights about sentence structure and meaning fed into modern computational linguistics. Things like the Google parser actually contain some ideas that were more popular in the Middle Ages than they were in the 1960s and 70s among linguists. And I may have had some role in making that happen. So this is something of the strange route by which I reach you and why I know about certain very out-of-the-way things that are going to come up. The textbook for the course is called The Soul of Science, Christian Faith and Natural Philosophy by Piercy and Thaxton. Piercy is a Christian apologist in the tradition of Francis Schaeffer. Thaxton I don't know much about. I understand you've met him, right?
Yes.
What's he noted for? What's he like? What's he like?
He's extremely intelligent. I think he was a Harvard grad. And he was living in the Czech Republic when I was living in the Czech Republic, and we went to the same church in Prague.
Oh,
That's very cool.
Very good. Melody and I have had dinner with Nancy Piercy and her husband. This was a local group invited her to speak, and they had a dinner before it, and they very deliberately put me with her. And the conversation at that table was very philosophical, while the other tables were sort of bewildered or something. But it was great fun. I like meeting intelligent people. I make it a practice to hobnob with people smarter than myself as much as I can. And that leads to some stories. I've met Nobel laureates without knowing that they were Nobel laureates and things like that. Anyhow, this is the textbook. You can order it on Amazon. The title is The Soul of Science. Now, what I'd like to begin with is some common misconceptions about science. Things you have probably been told and may even have believed that are not so. One of the most obvious, this is drilled into everybody from elementary school on, is that science is a fixed body of knowledge that you can memorize. It's a set of facts you learn, and they are never going to change. Remember all the hoopla about whether there are 9 planets or... People were complaining, and the loudest complaints I heard were basically, I memorized 9, and I'm not going to memorize anything different. And the fact is, more objects have been discovered, and either we drop back to the big 8 planets, the old list, or we have more than 9, and we're really uncertain about what some of them are like, and exactly how many there are going to turn out to be. So the fact is, science is constantly growing and changing. That doesn't mean that all of it is going to be disproved in the future, but it does mean that some of what we know is going to be disproved in the future. Genetics doesn't work the way Darwin thought it did, for instance. My daughter can tell us more about that. New discoveries are going to be made. Okay, a really big misconception or widely held belief, probably the thing that brings you into this room, is that science is hard to reconcile with the Christian faith. Have any of you gotten that impression from anybody? Found people who believe that? Find people who expect it? Well, one of the things we are going to spend a lot of time on is dealing with the fact that that's a misconception. It's a mistake. It's very widely held. I can even trace back who was feeding it to the public and when. Some people on both sides have a stake in promoting it. Not only are there scientists or people who think of themselves as scientific who think God can be totally dismissed, there are Christians who think science ought to be dismissed. That is really frustrating and stultifying. But there are Christians who think science is basically godless bunk. And I wonder, somehow they want a scientifically trained doctor when they get sick. At least some of them do, some don't. Anyhow, I do not think science is hard to reconcile with Christian faith. There's a really big reason why not, and we're going to get to it. When we get to a series of slides called The Big Idea, that's what we will be on. Many of you have been told there is a fixed procedure called the scientific method, which, if you follow it, gives you knowledge from raw data. Practice the scientific method. Follow the scientific method. This has been the bane of my daughters trying to do science fair projects, because there would inevitably be a very low-level judge who is only prepared to judge a project on effect of green light on plants. And anything outside of that, they say, oh, you don't have a hypothesis, or you don't have a this, that, or the other. My older daughter actually got the grand prize junior division in the state science fair, which I was very proud of for middle school, but she had to get past people who didn't understand why a computer simulation of genetics, embodied as an artificial pet game to play with, was science. because you're not doing a controlled experiment, okay? The fact is, there are fixed methods that work in narrow fields where there's a lot of data needing to be analyzed. Many people are what I call foot soldiers of science, who are basically part of an army of researchers who are collecting data about things like agriculture or medicine or something, and using the same methods on zillions of experiments, and this is immensely valuable to society. I'm glad that when COVID came out, we had an army of people testing hundreds of treatments on many different populations. I'm glad that we have better food to eat because so many agricultural researchers have tested so many different ways of improving productivity. But fixed methods don't fit all kinds of science at any time. Where are the controlled experiments in astronomy? Are we going to say astronomy is not a science because you don't do hypothesis testing experiments? No, astronomy works observationally, and it's just different, and that's still science. Further, when you study the history of science, you'll find that every major advance has generally required some adjustment of methods, some new methods of discovery. So there is not something called the scientific method. We can talk about whether you are evaluating evidence scientifically or not, but we can't say this is the scientific method and this is the way to do everything. Okay, many of you, many very good books give the impression that there was no science in the Middle Ages. There were the ancient Greeks, and then nothing happened until in the 1500s or later, people somehow awoke out of their ignorance and superstition, and science started again. Have any of you ever gotten that impression from a book you were reading? Yes, okay. Well, here are a few important scientists of the Middle Ages. Isidore, around 600 AD, compiled reference books trying to keep things from being forgotten in the collapse of Rome. Bede, who was mostly remembered for writing the history of the English church up to that time, actually was very interested in calendars, astronomy, and was the first person to work out that tides were basically caused by the attraction of the moon. There were many Arab Muslim scientists in the first few centuries of Islam who managed to have an educational system that worked a good bit better than the one in Europe did. So a lot of important things happened in the Arab world in the Middle Ages, including astronomy, which really advanced there. Algebra, the very word algebra is Arabic. Algorithm is another Arabic word, very corrupted, that comes out of medieval Islamic science. Gerbert or Gerbert of Aurillac, and when we get to a French name, I don't know how to pronounce it, not because I don't know French, but because I don't know whether it is the French of a particular time.
It's Robert Grosseteste.
Right, I'll get to him, but this is, I'm on the previous guy, Gerbert d'Aurillac, Gerbert of Aurillac, who introduced base 10 numbers into Europe. That was worthwhile, wasn't it? And also introduced the abacus into Europe. Okay, the next one, Robert Grosseteste or Grostet, maybe, depending on the state of French phonology in his time. Yes, that's the one you had in mind. What was the pronunciation you wanted to give? Robert?
Yeah.
And either Grosseteste or Grostet, depending on how, it means Robert Bighead. Okay, that's what the name means. He was one of the early leaders of Oxford University. Oxford University started in about 1150 and was small for about a century and then really got going in the mid-1200s. He was one of the top scientists. He was an advocate of physics, including advocating some experimentation. And he was a real advocate of putting science into the university curriculum. He's definitely a big name there. Roger Bacon By the way, the action was largely at the University of Paris and then Oxford in the Middle Ages. There was another university founded in 1209 called Cambridge, but it didn't quite get really going until a bit later. So not a lot of action at Cambridge in those days. Roger Bacon, not to be confused with Francis Bacon, his brother 300 years younger. No, that's not exactly right. They're not the same one, but Roger Bacon was interested in physics and mathematics, wrote a book on optics that makes sense, describes the refraction of light by glass. Apparently, he was one of several people to make eyeglasses in the Middle Ages, and he may well have invented the telescope, but if he did, it didn't catch on. He wrote some things that suggested he might have been able to make a telescope, but if so, he didn't really realize that it could be used to further science the way Galileo did. Okay, there was Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, who was a real advocate of all the sciences and putting them into the curriculum and of preserving all the scientific stuff written by Aristotle in ancient Greek times, some of which had just re-entered Europe by way of the Arabs. So he was a big advocate of science, very influential. I don't remember where he was active, whether it was Oxford or Paris. Nicole Orem, or Oresme, depending on the state of French phonology in his time, was an astronomer and mathematician whose work endures. He produced a table of the date of Easter that is still accurate. You can still use it. And it goes into our century and further. Okay. Now, another thing you have almost certainly been told is that the church actively suppressed and discouraged science during the Middle Ages. Have any of you ever been told that? The church stomped on science. Well, they must have not stomped very hard, because the church was supporting those universities, Oxford, Paris, Cambridge, where science was flourishing. In the list that I just showed you, Bede, Isidore, and Albertus Magnus have been canonized as saints by the Catholic Church. Grosseteste, whatever, was venerated as a saint in England, though he didn't quite get the official canonization. Orem, or Oresme, whatever, was a bishop. They weren't stomping on him. And Gerbert of Aurillac was better known to us as Pope Sylvester II. So I don't think the church was stomping very hard on its scientists in the Middle Ages. It was supporting a lot of them very generously. By the way, I haven't forgotten that I'm a Presbyterian. I have no vested interest in defending the Catholic Church. I think it made some pretty sizable mistakes, but this was not one. I don't think it made every imaginable mistake that anybody's ever accused it of. Okay, you may have been told that the church taught that the earth was flat and that Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan had to argue about that. There's a story in history books of Magellan saying that I will believe, something like I'll believe navigation rather than the church, or something like that. That the earth is not flat, the earth is round. He was the first explorer to go around the world. Well, that story about Magellan is a false story traced to a popular writer named Robert Ingersoll in the 1890s. Educated people had known the earth was round and had known its size fairly accurately since ancient Greek times. Okay, some of you are thinking, but wait a minute, my great-grandma didn't know the earth was round. Well, let's distinguish something. Let's not mix up what educated people know. That's the state of science in a particular time. What do educated people know? Versus what do ordinary people know? That's what the educational level is. And from about 1850 to the present, we've had in this country a very fast rising educational level. That makes it easy for us to imagine that 300 years ago, people didn't know anything about anything. But we're talking about educational level, not about what the few people who are highly educated know in some past time. I came across in my studies a diagram of an eclipse of the moon by William of Conches dating from 1150 AD, give or take 30 years. And it's just what you might imagine. It's a round sun and a round earth and a round moon and the shadow cast by the earth falling on the moon. Now he does have the earth in the middle of all the orbits because it's 1150. Copernicus hasn't come along yet. But he has everything right. Now, there's a widely published 19th century woodcut copy of this, but in fact, it is in the medieval manuscript. I am not sure whether I have seen it in the medieval manuscript, but one could confirm that by finding out what library it's in and whether they've digitized it. By the way, medieval scientific manuscripts are chicken scratchings. They're the most illegible handwriting in the world. Not only is it in Latin, it is extremely heavily abbreviated, like shorthand, something like quaeritur, which means the question is. Often the first word of a chapter, quaeritur, is a sort of Q with an R coming out the top of it. And the entire manuscript is abbreviated like that, so it's not easy going. Okay, many of you have been told, in fact, many people cling very tightly to the belief that the church regularly persecuted scientists. Have you ever heard that? Burned them at the stake. They got rid of all their scientists, they persecuted them. When someone brings this up with me, the thing I usually ask them is, name half a dozen of these persecuted scientists, please. Okay, everybody can name one. I was able to dredge up four, one of whom was not quite a scientist. Yes?
Galileo was.
Yes, Galileo is the one everybody knows about. Galileo was treated unjustly. Everybody agrees with that. In retrospect, nobody can explain why he was treated so badly, but it had something to do with his having a personal quarrel with either the Pope or somebody high up in a position of authority. Even then, he didn't leave the church. He didn't even become a Protestant, which might have been an option at the time. And he was only basically punished by house arrest, which was not very severe because he was old and disabled at the time and would have had to stay in his house all the time anyway. But Galileo was treated unjustly. No one denies that. Now, there's a character named Giordano Bruno who was burned at the stake. He was, I believe, a little later than Galileo, but only very slightly later. May not have been later. Same general era. I don't advocate burning anybody at the stake no matter what they do. The Catholic Church did some bad things, and that was one. However, Giordano Bruno was not burned at the stake for being a scientist. He was burned at the stake for occult practices. He was apparently trying to dabble in black magic, deny a large number of basic Christian doctrines. He did have some scientific guesses that were right about the universe having other solar systems, I believe is one of them. But he didn't have scientific evidence for them. They were just guesses. So Giordano Bruno is a man who was unjustly burned at the stake. But we don't infer from this that they were going around burning all their scientists. They weren't. It wasn't for being a scientist that he got in trouble. Okay, what did the church do to Copernicus? Nothing, because Copernicus died before his book came out. This was by plan, actually. He wouldn't let it out until he was on his deathbed. He expected quarrels, but What the church did with Copernicus is publication of his 1543 book was restricted. People having the book were required to write certain corrections in it. Very few did. Lots of copies of it didn't get the corrections made in them. So apparently that was a sort of low-key thing. They wanted to go on record as against Copernicus, but they didn't do much to actually stop the reception of his ideas. Okay, one last really shameful case. It happens to be 1100 years earlier. Hypatia, in 415 AD, when the Roman Empire was still very much going, was a Greek pagan. She was a mathematician of some sort and was murdered by a Christian mob in 415 AD. That is very sad. It's not something to be proud of. But again, she wasn't murdered because she was a scientist. She was murdered because they were having wars and killing people. She got on the end of being killed in basically a civil war type of thing. So if you want to defend the claim that the church regularly persecuted scientists, you don't have many examples to go from. I need to identify some misleading 19th century writers who are still influential. Robert Ingersoll, active in the 1880s and 1890s, actually there was a wave of scientific atheism in the 1880s and 1890s that still casts its long shadow into our textbooks today. Ingersoll was a popular speaker and writer. He was known as the Great Agnostic. He was the sort of Ayn Rand of his time. He had fans who looked to him for how to think about a lot of things. He wrote many books and essays popularizing atheism. He came up with this false story that Magellan had to argue about whether the earth was round, that Magellan had to say he didn't believe the earth believe the church when the church said the earth was flat. The church didn't say the earth was flat. Ingersoll just sort of tossed this off and it caught on. Two bigger reference works, John William Draper, History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, and that inspired an even bigger one, Andrew Dixon White, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, which I believe is a multi-volume set. It's been a long time since I looked at it. These became standard reference works because they're full of historical detail. And in the early 20th century, you don't have Wikipedia. You go to books like this to get the details of the history of science, and it happens to be a very slanted kind of history. They give the impression that there was nothing but conflict. Christians stomping on science, science incompatible with Christianity, and so forth. These misleading interpretations are still influential. They started a couple of generations of people believing that Christian faith and science just don't go together. The big idea, if you get one thing out of this course, I'm going to go ahead and give it to you so you can skip the remaining 9 sessions if you need to. I believe in delivering the goods early. Part of my communicative style is to tell you the main point and then support it, rather than tell you a lot of little things and make you wonder where I'm going, and then eventually I get to a main point. Okay, science arises naturally out of a Judeo-Christian worldview. Actually, this is also shared with the Muslims, which is why the Arabs did so much in the Middle Ages. We have a creator who made us in his image, which doesn't mean that our eyes and nose and mouth are a copy of his. It means that we're in some ways a similar kind of being. We can understand things. The creator authorized us to explore and utilize nature. That's right there in Genesis. And here's a really subtle point that you won't think of until you start comparing to other religions. God's creation was voluntary, so it makes sense for us to ask what God did in fact choose to make, rather than just say, God is perfect, everything in the world flows unavoidably out of God's perfection, and we can figure it all out by just thinking about God's perfection. Doesn't work that way. God chose to do things in particular ways, meaning we really have some learning to do when we want to learn what God did in what particular ways. This had a large role in the history of science, and I think one of the first people to point it out clearly was a non-Christian, Alfred North Whitehead of Cambridge, the logician and philosopher. By the way, Whitehead was my thesis advisor's thesis advisor, I think, if I counted right. You should always know who your ancestors are in your Ph.D. Well, mine are very distinguished: Whitehead, Quine, Wells, and me. You see how it declines. Really big name for 4 steps back. Rather a big name 3 steps back. Then it sort of sinks down. Now, contrast what I just said with how it would be if you were a mystic, like maybe a Hindu or a Buddhist, who only cares about the spiritual, not the physical. Or maybe like a Manichae or Gnostic, who believes the physical world is where all the evil is, and the spiritual world is all good, so you should be trying to cut loose from the physical world and dwell in the spiritual one. That won't make you a scientist, will it? A scientist is somebody who spends all this time studying this flawed, evil stuff, okay? What if you are an animist and you believe the rocks and the trees have spirits in them and might not want to be investigated? Don't mess with Mother Nature. That phrase is probably the last vestige of animism in our culture. What if Mother Nature doesn't want to be investigated? Okay, and the third thing is, if you're a convinced atheist, then you have no reason to believe, you have really no understanding of why you have a mind that is capable of doing any of this. Because evolution makes you survive, evolution doesn't make you philosophize. Evolution can make you a very efficient food finder. Evolution has no motive to make you a very effective philosopher or scientist. So the paradox for scientists who are atheists is the very existence of science is a deep mystery. There's no reason there should be any such thing. No reason human beings should be capable of it. Here's a really important point, and this is very important in popular culture now, even extending to things like politics. No, I'm not going to endorse a candidate. Christianity and science agree that truth matters. We have science because we're trying to find out what is real, not just make up something we like to believe. It should be the same in religion. I want to know what God actually has for me to know about himself, not make up a story of my own to entertain myself and ignore things that don't fit the story I have made up. In some academic fields in the humanities and in extreme politics on both the left and the right, there are people who don't see it that way and who merely want to have a narrative, a thing they can make up and believe in for themselves and then ignore everything else, and then disputes for such people are not settled by evidence, they're just power struggles. If you are a scientist and a Christian, that's a good combination. Have any great scientists ever been Christians? Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Euler, Faraday, Maxwell, Kelvin, Babbage, Heisenberg are the first few, and there could be a much bigger list. If you want to look at living scientists, Francis Collins of the Human Genome Project is a Christian. D.E. Knuth, the greatest living computer scientist, who made computer science into a subject is a Christian. Please, Dr. Knuth, take good care of yourself and live long enough to write volume 6. He's been doing a book series about algorithms for about 60 years, and it's not finished. And the ones I want are in volume 6, and he's only up to the middle of 4. Okay, Freeman Dyson, Astrophysics, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, is a Christian. Jocelyn Bell Burnell, the discoverer of pulsars, is a Christian. Now, if you've heard of Jocelyn Bell Burnell, you may also know of the somewhat scandalous fact that the Nobel Prize for discovering pulsars went not to her, but to her thesis advisor, Anthony Hewish. I don't know how that happened. I think the Nobel Committee was more at fault than Dr. Hewish. I can tell you they're both Christians, Burnell and Hewish. Hewish's son was in the University Christian Fellowship with me at Cambridge. So I don't know the whole history of that, but I do know there are 2 Christians behind the discovery of pulsars. H.F. Schaefer III, whom I saw walking down the street a couple of days ago, but he didn't see me. He's local. He's an extremely well-known computational chemist, also a very well-known evangelical Christian, right here at the University of Georgia. Now, how long should we go, by the way?
You have till 7:29.
7:29, okay. I will break for questions about 10 minutes before that. I'm relieved to probably have more slides than I will use up. I should warn you, it gets advanced in the next session. There's going to be some logic and philosophy that is definitely college level, and some terminology that you need to know in order to be able to follow this subject. You're going to hear about the Quine-Duhem thesis and why it shows that conspiracy theories are illogical and what Sherlock Holmes might have to do with it. You're going to hear a lot of advanced things with funny names. But right now, I want to give you an extremely short history of science. Science, as we know it, started with the ancient Greeks and especially with the philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle is remembered for writing a great quantity of books about all different subjects. He gave names to things like physics. He also wrote about things like logic. He wrote about literature, and if you read Aristotle's Poetics, which is a nice little book about literature, you'll find things in it that you were taught in high school, like tragedy versus comedy and tragic flaw and so forth, right out of the high school English class. But Aristotle's Poetics is the only book by Aristotle that I think is really well organized. Oh, except for one other, Nicomachean Ethics. That's a good read. That's ethics based on the idea that the opposite of a flaw is usually another flaw. And in between is the right way of doing things, so then you can fall off the horse on either side, so to speak. Not Christian, but very consistent with what we believe about morality. The science works of Aristotle are rambling and hard to read. He's not very well organized. He's the first person ever to write most of this down, because in his time, knowledge of things like plants was in the hands of farmers and such, not philosophers. Anyhow, Aristotle got a tremendous amount of stuff written down, not only about areas of science, but also about logic and thinking. One of his books, I believe it's called the Posterior Analytics, that means the second of the 2 books called Analytics, points out that a law of nature has to be not just true in this world, but true in all possible situations. So if you say that people breathe oxygen, you mean not just all the people that exist now, but you mean that if something didn't breathe air, it wouldn't be a human being as we now know them. Aristotle's goal, Aristotle gets stomped on by everybody after about 1500. Aristotle's goal was not to make new discoveries, it was to systematize and clarify what we already know and develop logic and classification. He was particularly concerned with living things. He started out to be a biologist. He started out to classify life forms, and he tended to assume that other things worked more like biological life than they actually do. So when you find people laughing at ancient or medieval science, it's often a case of this. Here's an example. The roots of a plant have a natural tendency to go down. The leaves have a tendency to go up, right? Because that's how plants work. Well, Aristotle, taking the similarity a little too far, would also say that a flame has a natural tendency to go up, or that a heavy rock has a natural tendency to go down. He didn't get around to gravity or the density of air or anything like that. He saw flames and rocks acting somewhat like a less intelligent kind of living thing that might have tendencies the way a living thing does. Okay? The Middle Ages mostly continued Aristotle, but with some introduction of experiments, particularly Robert Gross test and Roger Bacon. So as is traditional, I will skip the Middle Ages here and tell you the next big thing in the history of science was a set of developments in the 1500s to 1700s. We have experiments coming in. Don't just rely on existing knowledge, but test it yourself. Galileo, following the footsteps of Roger Bacon and Robert Gross test, probably not acknowledging them because in his time you had to claim to be radically original. We saw mathematics being used to an unprecedented extent in understanding how things work. That was Sir Isaac Newton's big thing, mathematics. We have a movement called atomism, which really is several different scientific ideas, but they resemble each other. The overriding resemblance is that what we see consists of smaller things we can't see. So instead of studying a goldfish, you study the cells in the goldfish, why they make it do what it does. In chemistry, you try to break matter down and figure out what kind of atoms it's made of. Eventually, in high energy physics, you break particles down into quarks, but that's 20th century. The point is, a new idea there is explain what you see by things smaller that you cannot see. All right, developments in the 1800s, the really big things. Astronomy makes the connection to physics, so the planets and stars are no longer a separate, mysterious kind of matter, but instead are matter just like we have on Earth at low pressures and high temperatures and other things that make it look different and act different. But the chemical elements in the stars are the same as the chemical elements here, as spectroscopy demonstrated. In biology, we get natural selection and evolution, which I will deal with at greater length later. But the point is, it's a big new idea in the late 1800s. It makes biology a bit less mysterious by connecting it to physical processes. Without the knowledge of DNA, biology is still extremely mysterious. Why do living things do anything like what they do? How can they possibly do that? Evolution in biology was easily misunderstood even by its own advocates. Darwin proposed a random process combined with natural selection. Many people began to believe, though, that this is what makes the universe automatically self-improving. Christian doctrine does not say the universe is automatically self-improving. Okay, you've got a problem there. In the 20th century, we have some developments. One that I forgot to get on the slides that is really important has to do with astronomy. Up until the middle of the 20th century, from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s, it was assumed the universe is, as far as we can tell, infinitely old and has never changed. So a real scientist would say there was no creation. As far as we can tell, it's all been the same forever. Well, in the mid-20th century, it was determined, first theoretically and then observationally, that in fact, the laws of physics don't go back an infinite length of time. If you run all the knowledge we have and the laws of physics and calculate back, you get to a point where you cannot deduce anything more, where the universe was extremely small and we don't know what it was like. This is known as the Big Bang. The leading advocate of that theory was in fact a Catholic priest named Georges Lemaitre. And some people gave him flack for trying to smuggle creationism in. But two things. Father Lemaitre pointed out that the Big Bang is not necessarily the creation. It's just as far back as the laws of physics that we have now go. We don't know what was before it. The second thing that happened, and this is the really big thing, the Big Bang predicts that there should still be microwave radiation coming at us from all directions left over from it with a particular spectrum. This is called the cosmic microwave background. Everybody said, oh, well, that's not there. The Big Bang can't possibly be real. Yes, it is. It was discovered and confirmed. The cosmic microwave background radiation more or less confirms the Big Bang theory, or else it's a deep mystery of its own. So that's the big change in astronomy. Astronomy suddenly got a lot closer to the Christian worldview in the mid-20th century without intending to. And this is why I tell Christians, let science do its thing. If you had decided in the 1890s that astronomy was atheistic and you shouldn't do astronomy, you would never gotten there. You would have never found what was wrong. So if you think a scientific theory is wrong and is going to contradict Christian belief, follow the trail, see where it leads. God is not going to deceive us. Okay, I'm going to leave out, I'm not going to start this section with some terminology pertaining to philosophy and logic. Today, we'll resume that next time.